We had already a lot of things to talk to you about, including the debt ceiling, Taiwan, Facebook. But let's start with this most recent news, this announcement of the OECD. What effect does that have actually in the legislative process up on Capitol Hill? Because one of the complaints from a lot of Republicans was we wouldn't be competitive as U.S. companies. Does this take that sting away a bit?
I think it does, David, and I think this is long overdue. We've seen countries arbitrage their tax rates for a number of years. One of my critiques of the Republican tax cut in 2017, it lowered the effective rate way below our 21% lowest of all OECD nations for a corporate rate. It lowered the so-called guilty international rate to 10.5%, bringing this up to 15% for all first world nations, I think is a step in the right direction. It will end also, one of the things we have to grapple with is ending putting intellectual property in a low tax regime like Ireland and putting your investment in factories in a higher tax regime like Germany. One of the things we're trying to work through on these international rates is that inability to play the system. This across the board 15% minimum, I think, is a step in the right direction. Frankly, more tax fairness, not just in America, but for all industrial countries around the world.
A step in the right direction, as you say, potentially a big step if we take the step. As I recall, there's a little issue about getting it through Congress. Doesn't there need to be legislation? What are the prospects?
There does, and unfortunately, this legislation is going to be simply carried by the Democrats. My Republican friends have said they don't want anything to do with what President Biden called his Build Back Better agenda, which is not only about raising some additional revenues and hopefully a fair way from our tax code, but also making some of the long overdue investments in things like childcare, paid family medical leave, trying to bring down the cost of prescription drugs, things that I think are very popular. And I wish, again, my Republican friends would join with us in this. But if they're not, we're going to do this through this kind of, again, bizarre process called reconciliation. And my hope is we will have a plan out shortly. It will probably be close to around $2 trillion. And I think there are ways to at least start down a series of these new initiatives, as well as some long overdue tax fairness that we've been working on for some time.
So, Senator, that's the budget. There is the issue that was the big issue yesterday, which is the debt ceiling, where we avoided something of a bullet, I guess, with the full faith and credit of the United States government, when there was an agreement between Chuck Schumer, the majority leader, and Mitch McConnell, the minority leader. You were involved in all that. How close did we come?
David, oh my God, if there was ever something that would have been a self-inflicted economic catastrophe, if somehow at this moment in time, when people, let's talk about it from a global standpoint first. When people were questioning, America's leadership after the kind of rocky exit from Afghanistan, as we see the PRC, the Communist Party in China, with the amazing number of overflights over Taiwan, pushing on Taiwan. If we had then purely not out of any economic necessity, but self-inflicted or damage, where we're saying America is not going to honor the full faith and credit of the United States, where we were going to somehow say we weren't going to raise the debt ceiling, mostly, unfortunately, led by my Republican friends, for dollars that we've already spent, dollars that we spent mostly under President Trump, it would have roiled the bond markets. It would have sent us the wrong signal to our allies and adversaries around the world. And I think this economic recovery, which unfortunately with the unemployment numbers today is not roaring back as strongly as we'd liked, it would have driven a stake through the heart of that economic recovery. So the good news is we punted for 2 months. The bad news is that we still have this crazy overhang. No other industrial country in the world has this, in a sense, political hand grenade that we roll out every couple of years. Every other country, if you appropriate dollars, that's the control you have over how you spend or not. This arbitrary debt ceiling process, I think we ought to get rid of entirely. And one of the things I've been talking to my Republican friends about is, let's go ahead and have one more fight, but then let's extend the debt ceiling till after the next congressional election and say at that point, let's get rid of it. Because, we don't know after the next election who's going to be in charge, Democrats or Republicans. Both sides have used this tool in political gamesmanship. And the best thing we could do for our country in terms of removing at least one crazy action that Congress couldn't inflict on our economy going forward is let's get rid of the debt ceiling once and for all. And then hold us accountable on how we spend dollars. If you don't like the way we're spending, fire us, but don't put this political gamesmanship tool, this literally hand grenade that you can pull the pin on anytime in the process.
Let's talk about something you just mentioned, which is Taiwan and some of the Chinese activity over right in neighboring Taiwan. As I understand, it's not technically Taiwanese airspace, but right adjacent to it. What do you make of what the Chinese are doing, and what can the United States effectively do in response, if anything?
Well, one of the things that we've seen is a very, very aggressive China over the last number of years, not only vis-a-vis Taiwan, but we've seen China move extraordinarily aggressively in areas where, frankly, we in America and the West have been leaders in technology investments. 5G, I was an old telecom guy, as you know, they are, with Huawei, are leading the world in 5G. What they're doing in terms of enormous investments in semiconductors, what they're doing in terms of artificial intelligence, quantum computing. This is an aggressive PRC unlike anything we've seen in our lifetime. And when I speak about China, I think it's really important to always make the point that our beef is with the Communist Party of China and Xi Jinping's leadership. It's not with the Chinese people. And this is not a dog whistle for, kind of bias against Asian Americans, Chinese Americans, or the Chinese diaspora anywhere in the world. But you've got in the PRC at this point a growing military that I think is trying to flex its muscles and see if we in America and the West are slightly off balance, and a very aggressive economic model where China allows a ferocious domestic competition in these new tech areas until a Chinese champion emerges. Now, obviously, the PRC has also clamped down on some of the Chinese tech giants in recent months. But this is a model where I think we both need to stand by Taiwan defense-wise, but almost as important, if not more important, we need to rally a alliance of democracies around technology, research and development, advancement. One of the things Congress, at least the Senate, has passed with a broad bipartisan margin would be a record $52 billion investment in semiconductors. We need to not cede that whole economic necessity of semiconductors to China. And frankly, some of the people who've said that one of the reasons why the PRC is being so aggressive about Taiwan is not only their goal to reunify, but as you and most of your Bloomberg viewers know, the largest semiconductor facilities in the world, often driven by the company TSMC, are located in Taiwan. Another goal that I think the PRC has about trying to lord over Taiwan.
And finally, Senator, I'm sorry to pack in so much, but you have an awfully packed schedule up there. Facebook, we heard from the whistleblower this week up testifying for the Senate. I talked to one of your colleagues, Senator Elizabeth Warren, about what kind of regulation, if any, would make sense. She said the only thing that's going to work is breaking them up. Do you agree?
Listen, I wouldn't start with breakup. And let me first of all also acknowledge, I've been on this issue now for 4.5 years, and it is frankly total irresponsibility that Congress has not done a single thing. So I would keep breakup as my backstop. I would start with data portability and interoperability. I mean, if you get tired of Facebook, you ought to be able to move all your data easily to a new site so you could actually have more competition. I think we ought to know what our data is worth. I mean, these services are not free. They market our personal information. We at least ought to know that. And this legal protection that's called Section 230 that basically allows Facebook to say no matter what happens on their site, they bear no responsibility. It's time for Section 230 to be reformed. So I would start with these actions because I do worry in a global economy when you've got, again, Chinese type competitors out there. We ought to start with reform, but Congress needs to act. My hope is that this week was that tobacco moment where maybe we're going to finally get our act together.